Hi, everyone. Welcome to our podcast, Conversations with B'nai B'rith. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. In this episode, I'll be speaking with two experts on Middle East policy from the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, or JISS, about Israel's ongoing defensive war against Hamas. Now, if you enjoy this podcast, subscribe to Conversations with B'nai B'rith wherever you listen and leave us a rating. And you can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and like us on Facebook for all of our latest content. Israel's defensive war in response to the barbaric October 7th attacks is more than just another round of violence between the Jewish state and Hamas. The destruction and the atrocities committed against Israel that have thus far left 1,200 Israelis dead, over 4,000 wounded, and more than 100 still held hostage in Gaza mark a turning point for Israel and how it operates in the Middle East. My guests today know a thing or two about Israeli security, diplomacy, and foreign policy. Efraim Inbar is founding director of the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security, a position that he's held since 2016. He's also a professor emeritus at Bar-Ilan University and a fellow at the Middle East Forum. Hillel Frisch is one of the Jerusalem Institute's leading scholars and an expert on the Arab world and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He's been a professor of political studies and Middle East studies at Bar-Ilan University for more than 20 years. We're fortunate to have both Efraim and Hillel with us today to talk about the regional and international implications of the war between Israel and Hamas, and how the October 7th attacks have further fueled anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment across the globe. Efraim, Hillel, thank you for being here today. We really appreciate your joining us.
Our pleasure.
Let's start with the big picture and what's happening right now on the ground. As we sit here almost 70 days into Israel's war against Hamas, how would you assess the military results to date with the objective of destroying Hamas both as a governing entity and as a military organization? Efraim, you first.
I think that Israel works very methodically, maybe too slow in Gaza, primarily in order to save casualties, in order to catch as many Hamas personnel and kill them, or to take hostages. We recently have seen pictures that we've not seen before in the previous rounds between Hamas and Israel. Hamas operatives with their hands up, and we are talking about great numbers, tens, hundreds, that were captured by the Israeli Defense Force. This is a sign that Israel is progressing, particularly in the northern part of the Gaza Strip. It attacked also Khan Yunis in the central part, and probably it will go south if the Hamas leadership will be there. So in military terms, so long, so good. We have relatively a small number of casualties, particularly if you compare it to urban battles like Fallujah, for example. So, but the Israeli spirit is high, and we're ready to pay the price.
Hillel, your take?
It's very important to realize that it's not controlling territory that's an issue here, because the real problem is the subterranean, under in the tunnels, and that's why Israel has to go very slow. I mean, it could have overran easily all of Gaza, but it would have left all the subterranean tunnels and their openings available to Hamas fighters, and then they would come and pick off, and Israel would be engaging in a war, in a very, very bloody war of attrition, which it would probably lose. So Israel is advancing only insofar as it's also uncovering this absolute, this subway, this 300-mile subway system that Hamas has been building since 2007, literally till 2007. So it's not a function of how much territory it takes over above ground, it's what it's doing underground.
Let's talk about the rest of the world and how it's reacted to all of this since October 7th. European nations in the beginning, many of them, not all of them, were among the first to show support for Israel. But after early affirmations of Israel's right to defend itself, and we heard that in a lot of places, with some very few exceptions like the UK and some others, most Europeans either want to turn their back or, on the contrary, if you've looked at some of the votes at the United Nations, they voted for immediate ceasefire resolutions. I think 8 European countries on that first resolution, which was introduced shortly after October 7th. This is against a backdrop, for example, of some of the same countries who sent forces and as part of NATO's effort to fight Al-Qaeda and ISIS. Why do you think there's a general silence here? Or worse, why the repeated calls now by some Europeans for a ceasefire? Efraim?
This is a Pavlovian instinct. Whenever there is some fighting, everybody calls for a ceasefire. Not always understanding that a ceasefire contravenes the goals of the war that they are interested in. I think in Europe, there is also a great fear of a refugee wave from Gaza into their countries. They have enough Muslims and they want the war to end as quickly as possible without too many displaced Gazans. This is a report I get from Brussels, actually. My son is working there at the embassy. This is a prime concern of the Europeans. Also, not all. I think that we can distinguish. The Italians are doing well, the Hungarians, the Czech, the Poles. It is Western Europe, particularly Ireland, that is behaving in a very anti-Israeli way. And this is not something new because they have a very great sensitivity to the Palestinian issue.
Hillel, what do you think? If you go back, even though Israel has bilateral relations with good bilateral relations with most European countries, if you go back to the early 80s, with the Venice Declaration, for example, where Europe says, what was then, I think, the EC, says that there needs to be sovereignty for the Palestinians. Over these years, Europe has essentially been the Palestinians' friend in court. Not every country, not at every time, but generally speaking. Whereas the U.S. has been the friend of Israel in court, so to speak. Do you think that same kind of intensity of support for the Palestinian narrative more or less exists in Europe? Or do you think, as Efraim has just said, that this is kind of Pavlovian, that this is just what they do?
I mean, first of all, I think that there's a tremendous difference between Eastern Europe and Eastern and Central Europe, states that feel threatened by a major power, and the Western and Western states, the Western European states that are not under an immediate threat. They just don't understand Israel's predicament. They don't understand the noose that is evolving and strengthening around Israel. I mean, it's not only Gaza. Gaza is a minor front compared to Hezbollah, compared to the nuclear threat in Iran, compared now to the closing of the Bab el-Mandab Straits by a proxy of Iran. The Western Europeans still don't think geostrategically. They still think in terms of peacemaking. I think it's beginning to change with Putin. He made a great service to Israel, and this is beginning to change. But it's going to take time amongst the Western European powers, and that means that these elected officials like Macron can come to Israel one day, fully supporting Israel, and then 2 weeks later, when he looks at his Muslim electorate, he has to talk a different rhetoric, at least from his perception. So this is going to be a slow change. the important thing is that the Europeans are not very important. The Americans are important. They call the shots, and Europe. No one in Israel trusts the Europeans. The Europeans can't deliver anything, and there's increasingly harmless to Israel over time, especially because of the energy resources that Israel has, and the shift of Greece and Cyprus to the Israeli camp. So we still have to put up with it, but I think that there is a change. This is what I hear. I'm no expert on European-Israeli relations, but this is what I hear also from our in-house experts.
Well, let me follow up on some of what you just said. Let's talk now about Iran's role in all of this. As of now, the Houthis in Yemen, backed by Tehran, have been firing rockets and drones at Israel, attacking shipping or interdicting shipping. They're doing this from Yemen. Iranian-backed proxies are attacking U.S. troops in Iraq and Syria. Now, over 90, I think today, as of today, about 90 or so. Why is it that policymakers in Western countries, we talked about Europe, but let's talk about the West, continue to look away from what is very clearly Iran's complicity in the upheavals of the past couple of months? Not only in the past couple of months, but here specifically since October 7th, but of course long before that. Talking now about JCPOA and a whole range of other issues. And what do you sense are the risks here for a wider scale confrontation with Iran? I mean, that's what we hear a lot on the news, explaining what Western positions are. The other side of that coin is that some say if there were a direct, strong response to the Iranians, that they would pull back. So, Efraim, your take.
Well, I think that the Europeans feel, as well as Americans, feel very uncomfortable to view Iran as an enemy. We've seen the Obama administration trying to make a deal with the Iranians. This administration is more or less the same. I think the Americans sent their air carriers to the region in order to prevent a regional escalation, because they don't want to take on the Iranians. They told Israel not to touch the Houthis. It is remarkable that this American administration pressured Saudi Arabia to stop its war against the Houthis. So the West generally is not interested in a confrontation with Iran. It has the wrong vision that Iran can be a partner in the regional alignment, and they don't read the geopolitics of the region. This is quite a problem for Israel, because the Americans try also to restrain us. We see maybe pressures for a political clock on Israel, although they want us to win against Hamas, because they're obsessed with the two-state solution, and they understand that Hamas in Gaza is not going along with the two-state solution. They are the enemy of the Palestinian Authority. But beyond that, they don't see eye to eye with Israel.
I'd like to add, why do we berate the Americans and the Europeans? General after general on Israeli television, the same generals who thought that they could buy off Hamas and appease them and change their nature, are now blaming the Netanyahu government for not having an end game in Gaza, when they should, at least from my point of view, be thinking, what is the end game? The end game is that we have to deal with our even more formidable enemies after Gaza, Hezbollah, and maybe the Iranians themselves. Because what this disaster has taught is that there is no deterrence. There is no containment of these enemies. they are much too dangerous to be contained, much too dangerous to be deterred. They can only be either very weakened or eliminated altogether. Regarding Hamas and Hezbollah, and this is a race against time, because once Hezbollah gets precision-guided missiles, it's going to be a different war. The war against Gaza is a luxurious war. We might have two suns right now in Gaza, but most Israelis don't. And there's electricity, there's sewage, there are no shortages. Everything's going smoothly. But once they have precise missiles, all of Israel's defense capabilities will be going to protect Israel's vital installations, leaving the Israeli civilian population center very vulnerable. And then we might know sewage breakdowns, electricity breakdowns, and real shortage, and maybe even hunger. So why berate the Europeans and the Americans for not understanding what Israel's real end game is? The end game right now is not dealing with the Palestinian problem. It's dealing with even the more formidable fronts that Israel faces.
Let's talk about the challenge of the last couple of days in terms of this ratcheting up of the Houthis' threats. I'm thinking of Nasser in an earlier era,
yes,
closing off shipping, big challenge to shipping. These are international sea lanes that are being traversed not only by Israeli-owned ships, but by everybody's ships. What are the options, do you think, for Israel to respond to the Houthi threat? Efraim?
Well, I think that the current judgment is to allow the Americans to deal with the situation. They are organizing an international flotilla. If we remember, in 1967, this idea was not very fruitful. Maybe it will be more fruitful now, but eventually, I think that we'll have to act together with our allies in the Gulf. They don't like the Houthis. They see the Houthis clearly as an Iranian proxy, which they fear. And we should, if there is a new Middle East, we should act together with the Saudis, with the Emiratis, to put an end to the Houthi rule of a very geostrategic important point in the world. This is a strategic imperative. And I can foresee cooperation between Israelis, Emiratis, and Saudis on this issue.
Hillel?
Of course, in conjunction also with the United States and possibly, French and British forces, because they are stakeholders in ensuring the waterways. So wherever Israel has its mouth full, more than its mouth full, in the West Bank, especially in the up and coming battle against Hezbollah. So wherever Israel can possibly find allies and cooperation to deal with the problem, they should. And the Houthis might be the problem where the international support might be forthcoming.
Well, looking at a couple of other important regional players right now, how would you assess the roles of both Egypt and Jordan in this crisis since October 7th? Efraim?
We see two levels of response. One, the public level, which is pro-Palestinian, in favor of a ceasefire, and the level what we call under the table, which is where the real interests of those countries are. Egypt, of course, doesn't want any success for Hamas, which is an offshoot of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, an enemy of the regime. Jordan also is viewing Hamas in the same light, as well as the other Arab states like Saudi Arabia, the Emiratis, Bahrain, all of them are supporting Israel. Interestingly, none of them have severed relations with us. Actually, the Saudis have said openly that they'll continue the discussions over normalization with us despite the war. So we see actually great support for Israel in this war against Hamas at the elite level of the Arab world. The public is something different, and we leave the rulers to deal with it.
I would just like to say that there is concrete evidence for the cooperation between Jordan and Egypt and Israel. They set up hospitals. They set up temporary hospitals in the south of Gaza as part of the Israeli plan to move the civilian population from the north and central areas to the south. This is complete betrayal of Hamas. I mean, Hamas didn't want to see Arab actors enticing the Gazan population southward. This is a defeat for Hamas. And nevertheless, Jordan and Egypt played ball with Israel. So it's also on the concrete level. There's also something else that is positive. The Arab street is certainly pro-Palestinian, but the Arab street in both Jordan and Egypt, and to a lesser extent Lebanon, have not really mobilized, and including Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, the Palestinians. They have not delivered. The Hamas has been betrayed. The Hamas is fighting Israel alone. In fact, the only really strong Arab street is in Harvard and in some American universities and in London and Paris. That's where they're strong. They're relatively weak in Egypt, Jordan, and they're also strong in Indonesia, but that's a long way away.
Let me just ask one more question about this. Do you see Egypt being pressured to allow a flow of refugees across the Rafah border crossing? What do you think? I mean, it hasn't in big numbers. It certainly has not happened to date.
I doubt very much that President Assisi likes the idea of having Gazans in his territory, particularly not in Sinai, when he has to face Islamic uprising. There are Islamist elements there fighting the government, and obviously he fears that more Gazans will join those troops. In any case, there is a rhetorical question. Who wants Gaza? And I don't think there are many positive answers, and definitely Egypt is not one of the takers. Nobody wants Gazans. I heard that maybe Turkey would like to have some and to populate them in the eastern parts of Turkey, where the Kurds are, to dilute the proportion of the Kurdish population, as well as in northern Cyprus. But generally, I don't see any takers of Gazans in the world.
How do you think Israel's defensive war against Hamas will alter the trajectory? And there had been a trajectory. We were just talking about the Abraham Accords countries, normalization, the Saudis. And we really, I believe, and I'm sure you agree as well, that we were on the cusp of some kind of normalization arrangement on the eve of October 7th. But how much do you think that all of this, in the long term, will alter that trajectory of stability and progress? As you have pointed out, no full breaks. In many cases, not much being said. In many cases, not a lot of folks in the streets. So how do you think it's going to go, let's say, 6 months from now, a year from now? Where will we be with those very promising relationships which we have experienced over the last couple of years?
I think the answer is very simple. The more Israel goes after Hezbollah and Iran, the more normalization we will have. These are what the Gulf states want from Israel. They came into the normalization process for one reason, because they perceived that the Americans were leaving the Middle East, and they had to unite with a strong Israel against a very, very formidable threat. We have to remember, Iran and its proxies are as great a threat, if not more, to these Gulf states than they are to Israel. I mean, the Iraqi invasion in 1991 of Kuwait proved that these are walkover states. It took one day for Iraq to take over Kuwait. It'll take Iran half a day to take over United Arab Emirates. The only thing that can stop it is if there's a strong reaction by Israel towards Iranian-led aggression and some action against its proxies. It's not that normalization is being tempered by an Israeli more aggressive endgame to deal with the noose around it. It's if they deal with the noose that will bring Arab states to closer relations with especially the Gulf states with Israel. Of course, the complete exception to this rule is the kingdom of evil, the emirate of evil, Qatar. Qatar is certainly the outlier in this scenario that I've outlined.
Efraim.
I fully concur with my colleague Hillel. The accords, the Abraham Accords, are predicated on a strong Israel. And we have to show that we are strong. What happened in Israel before the war, all these demonstrations, all these domestic troubles about the legal reform, which I don't want to take sides, but in any case, this was something that the Arab states were very concerned. Actually, we've seen in the Arab press, in the Iranian press, clear signs that they see that Israel might disintegrate as they wish. We actually issued, JISS issued a warning of an impending war if things don't change. So being strong is very important. Fear is the best political currency in the Middle East. They have to fear us. And if Iran fears us, if Hezbollah fears us, the better our relations with the rest of the Arabs are.
Well, now let's talk about the end game. The war against Hamas had hardly begun when critics of Israel started asking Israel to explain its view of Gaza without Hamas. What's your end game? My question to both of you is how do you see it? In the early stages, we saw the U.S. and international actors push the idea that the Palestinian Authority should eventually take over the day-to-day governance of Gaza after the war. All of that despite Fatah's own warlike language about Israel and the PA's well-known history of rewarding terrorists or their families with pay-to-play stipends. Others have suggested an Arab peacekeeping force that might be an interim answer. We also hear calls now again for what many believe was the discredited idea of a two-state solution. It's now back on the table. Realistically, though, what do you see as the outcome after day one, after the end of this war? Brian?
Israel's goal for the day after is to maintain freedom of military action. This is what we want. We really, at least I don't believe that in Gaza something positive may grow. It's a cursed place. We have to realize. And therefore, we need freedom of action to mow the grass, to kill the terrorists, to limit their capabilities to act against us. This will continue. This has to continue. Therefore, I'm against any international force that will hinder our ability. And paradoxically, I think the PA should be reinstated because it's weak and corrupt. This conflict is not going away. It will continue for many years. And I think another Palestinian failure at ruling over Palestinians is necessary in order for the Palestinians as well as the world to learn that the two-state solution so far, and I don't know what the future will be, is simply not a solution. I must say that the Americans are very important to us, and what we suggest to them has somehow to be acceptable to their thinking. We don't want a crisis in US-Israeli relations. And this thought is something they can live with, and they cannot live with our true agenda, which Hillel mentioned, that we should go after the resistance axis. We should go after Hezbollah and Iran. This is our main agenda, and this is what we should prepare for. We have advocated preemptive strike against Lebanon. And of course, for years, we advocate use of force against the Iranian nuclear program. This is our true agenda. Hamas, as Hillel said, is basically a minor arena, and unfortunately, we are forced to deal with it now rather than to deal with the more important actors. But the Americans are not with that on this issue.
I think
well,
it's
Hillel, what's your Endgame prognosis?
Okay, so the first thing is the time reference. It took 4 years after the reconquest of Judea, of the Palestinian Authority in 2002, to bring down terrorism to levels of terrorism in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria to levels that Israel could live with. 4 years. It took 4 years. In Gaza, one can assume safely that it's going to take as long, if not longer. So the Israeli presence, not only raids, but the Israeli presence with boots on the ground, digging up that subterranean empire that Hamas built is going to take years. Because if you don't destroy that infrastructure, if you don't destroy almost every military industrial installation that they've formed underground, they're just going to come back with tremendous alacrity, because they have Iran and Qatar as their allies. Iran with the military know-how, and Qatar with the financial. The problem with putting the Palestinian Authority in Gaza is very simple. Fatah is totally discredited in Gaza. The Gazan population remembers the anarchy that prevailed from 2001 to 2007 in Gaza, when Fatah forces fought each other, the security forces fought each other. These were day-to-day battles. They'll never accept the Palestinian Authority in Gaza. So what will that mean? The Palestinian Authority bureaucracy will come back, and they'll continue spending the $2 billion at least that they've spent throughout Hamas rule in Gaza. They'll continue to pay that, but they'll be paying off the Hamas and jihad terrorists to ensure their safety. That's the problem. And when you have $2 billion and you can siphon off 20 to 30% of that, that's already a terrorist empire that can renew the Hamas threat to August 7th, 2023 dimensions. Israel's going to have to be there, and there's just no one else. that's going to do the job in the near future. Maybe the Palestinian bureaucrats, as opposed to, I keep on telling this to Efraim, he never accepts it, are good bureaucrats. They know how to rule both under Hamas and in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, under the Palestinian Authority. Education is on a good level. We're all beneficiaries of the pharmacists, the doctors that they produce, and because they serve us in the Jerusalem area. There is sewage, hospitals work. In other words, they're a decent governance institutions, at least by third world standards. Israel might be able to persuade these technocrats to work with it, although it won't be simple because they'll be subject maybe to assassinations and to security threats. There's nothing simple about Gaza. There's a famous poster from immediately before the Sinai campaign. The kibbutzim along the border were very leftist. They were mapam. They opposed Israel's dealings with the imperialist powers because they were still under the sway of Stalin and communist Russia. So they brought out a poster imploring these kibbutzim and begging, saying, we're going to go into Gaza and we're going to solve your security problems. You can read that poster as if it were issued yesterday. It's the exact same story. Nothing has changed. It was bad then during the Fidayun, and it'll continue being bad today. We just have to bring it down to levels with which terrorist levels with which Israel can continue to thrive and prosper.
Well, final question for both of you. Beyond the war itself, the dominant issue facing Jewish communities around the world is the tsunami of anti-Semitism that has been unleashed post-October 7th. Now, to be clear, global anti-Semitism was spiking before October 7th for the last number of years. And while not a geostrategic issue by itself, the surge of Jew hatred could affect domestic political thinking and policy decisions in a number of countries. So as strategic analysts, how do you assess this phenomenon, this explosion of anti-Semitism as a short-term and a long-term issue? Efraim?
We should realize that anti-Semitism is not a new phenomenon. It is with us for 2,000 years, at least. And this is basically a disease that is very well spread among the Gentiles. I'm not sure that we can really uproot this phenomenon from Western countries, particularly Christian countries. This is part of the Christian heritage. So I'm very skeptic about the ability to, what people call, to fight anti-Semitism, to show that we are actually nice people and not bad people. Nothing is going to convince them. Those attitudes are deeply rooted in Western societies, in Western culture. And I don't think we can do much about it. I think we should convince the righteous Gentiles. It is their job to cure their societies of this disease. Israel and not even the Jewish communities can do much about it. There are peaks sometimes in anti-Semitism. Of course, after the Holocaust, things were different. America, to a great extent, is different than Western Europe, but anti-Semitism is there, and it's something that the Jews in the diaspora will have to live with, and not to believe that they will be embraced by a philo-Semitic society.
Well, in response to that, I would say we have some friends. There are some friends, and they've done some important work. International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, for example, the IRA definition. But there is so much more to do, and it seems like now it's incoming from so many different places. It is indeed a tremendous challenge. So, with that, Hillel, I'll give you the last word.
I think that the real problem is how will the Jews in the diaspora react to this rise of anti-Semitism? Will it bring to a severance or a growing differences between the diaspora and Israel and the Israeli connection? But I think that most diaspora Jews, especially American Jews, are sufficiently educated to know what happened to Germany's Jews, the Jews who tried to assimilate, and what eventually happened to them. They can't. Their attempts to appease the anti-Semites won't work. So I think that most American Jews, most Jews in the diaspora, will stick with Israel out of that learning from the 1930s that appeasement with your enemies is not going to get you very far. It might even be your undoing.
Well, you can read much more from Efraim, Hillel, and the entire Jerusalem Institute team at jiss.org.il. Efraim, Hillel, on behalf of myself and B'nai B'rith, thank you both for joining us and for your invaluable insights today.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Well, thank you again to my guests, Jerusalem Institute Director Efraim Inbar and leading scholar Professor Hillel Frisch, for joining us. And a special shout out to the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security for making this conversation possible. And of course, thank you for viewing our program today. We hope you enjoyed what you've heard. If you did, please share it with others, post about it on social media, or leave us a rating. And for all of our latest content, and if you haven't already, follow or subscribe to Conversations with B'nai B'rith wherever you get your podcasts. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and like us on Facebook. We also ask that you consider donating to our Israel Emergency Fund and stand with us unwaveringly in support of Israel during this time of great need. Find out more at b'naibrith.org/Israel at War. This is your host, Dan Mariaschin. For my guests, until next time, take care, everyone.